Pause. Recording progress. All right, so I'm just gonna I'm gonna turn off my video, my audio, and I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sixth installment of our High Elevation 5 Needle White Pines 2024-2025 Science and Management webinar series. I'm Enzo Martelli, a PhD student in Karen Nelson's lab at the University of Montana, and I'm co-organizing this webinar with Ludo Lucy, a PhD student in Daniel's Ulrich lab at Montana State University, and Karina Lee, a master's student in Diana Tombach's Forest Ecology lab at CU Denver. We have another great presentation for today, and I'd like to start by introducing our director, Glenda Scott, who will share a few announcements with us. Welcome, Glenda.
Thanks for having me. I want to give a shout out to Enzo, Lou, and Karina. This is the fourth year that actually a group of volunteers from these key universities in the northern or the Rockies have been putting it on, and it's just become a signature event of the foundation. And I want to thank you volunteers for doing this and for all the participation from the wider audience. One thing I want to share is in the chat box, Whitebark Pine Foundation of Canada. You met Randy last month, and he and Jody Krakowski are putting on a training, survey methods and tree health assessment in the Cascade Mountains of BC, Manning Park ski area. So I want to bring that to your attention. I think they're going to it will show up in your the chat box to the right, and you can register and find out more information. So that's a great Sarah Goking. Yeah, we'll get that up there, Sarah. So just check back, okay? But that's a great opportunity and some really interesting and strong people to put that training on. The last thing I just want to mention is we are entering into information tabling season. So lots of conservation festivals, events throughout the state and throughout the range of Whitebark, of course. A couple that are around Missoula and Kalispell we have is Earth Day, Wild Walk. I know Enzo's involved in some of that. And as am I. If you see us at a table, stop and say hi. And if you would like to help with the table in your community, Aaron Clark is our uh, chair for the education committee, and we can sure get you in touch with Aaron and get you information so that we can reach a broader audience. And it's kind of a kick. You get to talk to people and share your knowledge about Whitebark. So that's a great way for to get that knowledge out to a wider audience. So I just want to encourage you to do that. And if you see us at a table, be sure to stop and say hi. So with that, thanks.
Thanks for joining us today, Glenda. We're definitely going to have a really interesting and active spring and summer sessions for us. So if you miss any of our previous installments, you can find the recorders on the talks on our YouTube channel, Whitebark Flicks. The link to our website will be posted in the chat box in the following minutes. And finally, after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session led by Lou, where you can share all the comment, doubts, and questions. And just a reminder, please post them on the chat box, and our team will be collecting them throughout the presentation. And for comments, we always recommend to give some context on the slide or part of the presentation you're referring to make it easier to follow. And yeah. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Kira Hefty. Kira is a biological scientist whose research has focused on wildlife distribution modeling and habitat assessment. She has a diverse background working among land managers and within academia. Kira is inspired to produce defensible science that is directly informed by and responsive to conservation and management needs, from forested wetlands to rangelands and high elevation conifer forests. Kira has worked with managers to develop and assess management strategies in regions highly affected by both acute disturbance such as wildfire and prolonged landscape change associated with climate change and habitat fragmentation. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Kira.
Great. Thanks so much, Enzo, and nice to see virtually all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Kira Hefty. I am a biological scientist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. It's kind of a mouthful. If you haven't heard of us, we are part of the USDA Forest Service, embedded within the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and we're based in Missoula, Montana. And kind of our reason for existing is to do work and research within federally designated wilderness. And so most all of the projects that we have, we work with wilderness managers and their collaborators on issues of importance or emerging issues that pertain to federally designated wilderness areas. So if you need any wilderness research done, feel free to reach out to us. We have a number of very talented researchers. But what I'm going to be presenting on today is a project that we've been working on for the last couple of years. We kind of fondly refer to it as the RAD and Wilderness project. And as part of that project, we delved into case studies looking at wilderness challenges, species conservation challenges within the context of wilderness. One of those happened to be whitebark pine, which I'll get into in a little bit here. And so this presentation is going to focus on a framework, a climate change adaptation framework that we had applied to whitebark pine ecosystems throughout the United States, but with a particular focus on wilderness areas in particular. And so if you're not super familiar with wilderness, that's okay. We'll give you a little bit of a rundown here. So wilderness, these are areas that were established as part of the 1964 Wilderness Act. And these lands are some of our highest protected lands in the United States. And they're protected for very specific, what we call wilderness character qualities. And those are the words that are in bold there. And so these lands are protected in an untrammeled and undeveloped state. And so with the intention that human presence is not supposed to be a significant influence on the processes or the viewshed of these particular natural areas, they are meant to be managed for their natural conditions. So without the influence, again, of modern day influences of man, and what you see on the landscape is primarily impacted by the forces of nature. They're meant to be opportunities for solitude and having primitive recreation experiences. And they're also, depending on which wilderness area you may be in or where that wilderness area is located, managed for other features of value. And this can be refugia for sensitive flora and fauna species. They can be preservation of ecosystem services, important cultural artifacts, etc. Even though these areas are really highly protected, that doesn't necessarily make them immune to a lot of our modern day challenges. And one of those challenges primarily being ecological transformation. So just a brief description of what transformation means in the context of our natural areas is this emergence of a new or novel ecological community. And this can be a result of acute or prolonged disturbances such as wildfire, invasive species. And what happens is that normally how we manage a lot of our public lands is that we manage these areas within a certain range of variation that we are familiar with. And so if you have a wildfire or a disturbance, what you'll see is that there's a little bit of shift in the composition and structure of that system that you're managing. If you look on this figure on the right, we kind of have regime 1 here. That's the current state, that ecological state of our system, and some sort of disturbance will kind of push that composition or structure of that ecosystem into something that's a little bit different, but eventually that ball will likely roll back downhill and kind of fall back into those conditions that we are familiar with. But what's happening under ecological transformation, particularly with climate change, is that we are getting so much energy in the system that we are pushing this ball, the set of ecological conditions that we are familiar with, over this threshold. And it's really difficult to get that system back to what it used to be historically. And so that's what I mean by ecological transformation. We know that climate change is a prominent driver, in particular of ecological transformation, and this is because it's exacerbating those existing disturbances that we have on the landscape, such as wildfire, coupled with the spread of invasive species. You can see in this image here, this is in Joshua Tree National Park, where they're having lots of issues with invasive grass species, and coupled with wildfire that's changing the wildfire disturbance regime and leading to these high intensity fires, which is essentially taking out entire swaths of Joshua Tree forests. And so these areas are being converted from primarily Joshua Tree overstory to kind of more of this grassland system. And this is particularly pertinent in drought in the Southwest, is a prominent driver of this associated with climate change. And so this kind of begs the question when we're thinking about these wilderness character qualities, unnatural, or natural, trammeling, et cetera, can we consider these areas still, recognizing that climate change is a human-caused problem, as areas that are untrammeled and primarily influenced by natural forces? And so the question a lot of managers are asking themselves right now is, what can we do about this? Do we have an ethical responsibility to respond to climate change driven transformation in wilderness areas that we manage? Kind of what do we do to respond to this transformation that we're seeing? This is an understanding that it's not necessarily prohibited to take action within wilderness, but the actions that you take within wilderness are really highly scrutinized. And so the actions that you might take in wilderness might look different than the actions that you would take outside of wilderness. And so one of the phrases that gets thrown around a lot is the use of minimal allowable tools. And so maybe instead of using a gas-powered chainsaw, you use a crosscut saw to do some thinning, et cetera, trying to minimize those impacts to wilderness character qualities. And so one of the things with climate change and ecological transformation, if naturalness means maintaining those historical conditions, those conditions that we're familiar with, and particularly when we're talking about specific species like whitebark pine, do those specific species or qualities make up what we consider natural properties or natural quality of wilderness? And then therefore, do we have this need to preserve those natural qualities? However, if we choose and determine that we do, then it's likely going to take trammeling or come at the cost of trammeling to preserve those qualities through ecological transformation. And of course, with that, doing anything in wilderness comes with the risk of litigation and that balance of trade-offs for wilderness character. And so preserving naturalness versus the untrammeled quality, or vice versa. And so wilderness managers are kind of really in this conundrum, or what we're calling a wicked problem of, if you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't. So if you do something about how these systems are transforming and intervene to try to change the direction of that trajectory or that transformation, that's going to come at the cost of trammeling. However, if you choose not to do anything, that might come at the cost of the natural quality of these systems. And so the question really is, how do we move forward? How do we begin to untangle this really wicked problem? And there really isn't a right or wrong answer to this. But what we can do is try to be really intentional and mindful in how we are approaching these problems. And the way that we can do that is to incorporate the best available science into our decision making. We carefully weigh the trade-offs of implementing any type of action within the context of wilderness, including the trade-offs for wilderness character. And use decision support frameworks as kind of a standardized method to try to walk through these really complex and complicated challenges. And so we are loading. Hopefully you can still hear me. But one of the things that we tried to accomplish with this project was kind of these particular points. And so this is where the RAD framework comes in. Second. I can keep talking, but might need to reboot the presentation here. We use the RAD framework as one of those decision support frameworks to support some of the decision making, particularly in the context of wilderness. Hang on. Sorry, hang on. I might need to stop sharing and reload for a sec if this doesn't reload. Here we go. Oop. All right, I'll just keep talking while I get this open here. And so we use the RAD framework and applied that to 4 different case studies. And so we had 4 case studies per wilderness administering agency. And so that includes the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. And we applied this framework to 4 separate case studies per wilderness administering agency. And our goals as part of that project were to kind of create this generalizable framework with which we could implement RAD for each of those case studies, even though the topics for each of those case studies were quite a bit different from each other, provide science and decision support. And so as part of those case studies, in addition to just applying the RAD framework, we also conducted both biological science and social science analyses to understand how those systems are transforming for each of those case studies, as well as how managers perceive their ability to respond to those transformations. And then finally, we engaged another tool in addition to RAD to help managers evaluate the consequences of choosing RAD decision alternatives. And I'm really sorry, my computer is not, not being cooperative right now. And so RAD is a framework, if you're not familiar. RAD is an acronym. It's 3 letters, R-A-D, and those 3 letters stand for resist, accept, direct. And those are all oriented to how we might choose to respond to potential transformation. And so if we choose to resist, I'm just going to stop sharing. If we choose to resist transformation, what we're doing is we're trying to maintain historical conditions or conditions that we are familiar with for as long as possible. And so this might look like kind of your typical restoration techniques where you go in and you choose a restoration strategy to try to restore an area back to historically some condition that you are familiar with or that you want to retain over a period of time. And so that's the resist strategy. In comparison, the accept strategy is that you are actively choosing to accept that transformation that you are seeing on the landscape. And so instead of trying to resist it and restore conditions that might be historically familiar, you accept that transformation and just allow it to continue. And perhaps under this strategy, and this is one of the reasons why we chose this strategy, this framework for our project, is that wilderness areas, because of that high scrutiny of actions within wilderness, that accept strategy might be particularly pertinent. And so instead of going in and intervening and using active management, we are instead choosing to observe how those systems are transforming over time. And then the direct strategy is a little bit different. Instead of trying to resist change or accept the change that you might be seeing on the landscape, instead what you're doing is directing that transformation that you are witnessing on the landscape toward a future that might be more desirable. And so that future might look different than it does currently today. But you're trying to at least alter the trajectory of the transformation that you're seeing towards something that maybe is more in line with your objectives and your desired conditions for the system that you manage. And so the goal with RAD is to be intentional in our decision making. And so instead of, for example, in wilderness, kind of implicitly relying on those accept strategies, we are consciously weighing the trade-offs of choosing an accept strategy versus, let's say, a direct strategy, expand here, or a resist strategy. All right, sorry about that. I think we're back. And so here's just a little graphic of what that looks like now that I've explained it. And so except in your direct strategy, your future conditions are going to look quite a bit different. Resist your future conditions are going to look most similar to what they look like today. And here is just a graphic of our 4 case studies. Now that I've gone over these a little bit, you can kind of see where they're located. For our National Park Service case study, that was for Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior. We had the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness in Southwest Colorado. We had a couple of different national wildlife refuges for the endangered Sonoran pronghorn in the Southwest. And then, of course, Whitebark pine, which was our Forest Service case studies, primarily working with Forest Service managers. And that was the distribution or the full range of whitebark pine within the United States. As part of this project, we had several stages. We had this kind of information gathering stage, our science investigation stage. So I mentioned we did both biological and social science analyses. Our workshops, we had these in-person workshops to deliver the results of those science analyses, as well as move through an adaptive management process to implement the RAD framework. And now we're kind of in this final reporting. So we've completed these first 3 stages for all case studies, and we've kind of arrived finally at these post-workshop deliverables. And so as I'm moving through the rest of my presentation, you'll see kind of in the upper right-hand corner of my slides, these headings here to help orient you on where we are in this process throughout the course of this presentation. And so we chose whitebark pine as a case study for the Forest Service because we recognized, and it's been well known, that a large part of the range of whitebark pine, approximately 50% of the range of whitebark pine in the United States, is either within federally designated wilderness or recommended wilderness. And recommended wilderness areas are a little bit different. They're not federally designated, but they're managed similar to wilderness, federally designated wilderness areas. This often includes national park lands. But in total, both recommended and federally designated wilderness make up 50% of the current range of whitebark pine. And these areas are really highly protected. However, even though we don't have direct human development within these wilderness areas per se, the impacts of climate change as well as other persistent stressors are causing large areas of mortality within parts of the range and within wilderness. And so, for example, we're seeing large die-off or mortality events within the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, which is here in Montana, and the Selway Bitter Wilderness, which is just south of Missoula here in Montana. And this is due to factors such as white pine blister rust, bark beetles, historical wildfire suppression, et cetera. And so these events are still occurring, even though these areas are highly protected. And then when you combine that with climate change impacts, so climate change including increasing temperatures, which has been linked to direct mortality of whitebark pine, we have fluctuating precipitation patterns, decreasing humidity and soil moisture, and all of those impacts are exacerbating those current threats and introducing new threats to whitebark pine ecosystems, such as increasing wildfire potential, increased stress on trees, and pest and disease outbreaks, direct mortality, and decreased recruitment. And so these persistent stressors times climate change or with climate change really can lead to a whole transformation of these systems. And what I mean by transformation for whitebark pine ecosystems specifically is either the complete loss of whitebark pine, kind of resulting in this almost moonscape in these areas where we've lost whitebark pine, or perhaps a replacement of whitebark pine by other species that are moving upslope, other tree species. And so we might not have a complete moonscape in the second scenario, but we might have a slightly different species composition, and we might have lost some of those ecosystem services that are provided by whitebark pine, such as these high value, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, but these high value nutrient dense seed sources for Clark's nutcracker might be impacted by loss of whitebark pine or conversion of whitebark pine. Some of the other ecosystem services, such as its ability just to be a nurse tree for other plant species, shelter for numerous wildlife species, its ability to retain snowpack and decrease erosion. Cultural values in the area might be affected, such as storytelling and ceremonies, recreational experiences, as well as biodiversity. And so when we're talking about conversion or transformation for whitebark pine, we're really talking about the whole ecosystem that whitebark pine facilitates. And so moving into some of the science analysis to kind of get at the heart of the impact of this transformation and how people are perceiving the impact of this transformation. One of the things that we did, one of our social scientists, Jacqueline Fox-Rushing, engaged in a series of interviews with public lands managers to understand how they both are responding to currently and feel they can or cannot respond to these transformations, specifically within the context of wilderness. And so some of the things that came out of these interviews, some of the themes that she drew on from these interviews is that managers often felt that we need to try to act outside of wilderness first. This was particularly a prominent response in regions of the United States where there still was quite a bit of whitebark pine outside of designated wilderness, but this wasn't true across the board. There are some areas where most of the whitebark pine currently in areas of the United States is already in wilderness. And so sometimes those responses changed a little bit depending on where you were regionally in the country. And for those managers that were considering implementations or actions within wilderness, they felt that limited actions would be most feasible. So this might be identification of those plus and elite trees, those rust-resistant trees, cone collections, perhaps prescribed fire and planting rust-resistant stock. But most of those actions have not yet occurred within the context of wilderness or have only occurred in a very limited sense. And those limitations that managers feel when they're thinking about recovery actions in wilderness, there are several of them. These areas are often very difficult to access. And so these are predominantly roadless areas. So accessing these areas requires several people, can require pack stock, can take several days to get to some of these wilderness areas. Also, there's just generally, this is very common across the board, lack of staff capacity to engage in actions in wilderness. Some folks felt that this wasn't a priority for their line officers and that there was a lack of support from the wilderness program in general. And also trying to get permission or get approval to do actions within wilderness can involve a very lengthy process where you have to submit additional paperwork to then be able to take action within wilderness. And moving into some of the biological science results very quickly here, but what we investigated was climatic suitability for whitebark pine, and we did this kind of throughout the Western United States using a gridded climate data set called TerraClimate, and look in FIA data to see where whitebark pine is currently and what climate conditions it's currently associated with. And what we're seeing here, one of our main results that came out of this work was that the range of whitebark pine is shifting. It's contracting primarily, but the importance of wilderness as habitat for whitebark pine is becoming more prominent. And so on what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is kind of current or reference state climatic suitability for whitebark pine. So all those areas that are in blue. And what we're seeing today, according to these models, is that 42% of the good whitebark pine suitability, the climatic suitability, is within or encompassed by wilderness. And then comparing that to about mid-21st century, about 70% of climatically suitable area for whitebark pine is within federally designated wilderness. And so that wilderness component is going to become more and more critical moving forward when we're talking about recovery actions for the species as a whole. We break this down by region. Again, this was kind of our Forest Service case study. And so the map on the lower right-hand side of the screen there, the different Forest Service regions. So region 1, 2, 4, 6, and 5 all have whitebark pine. And that's what you're seeing in this bar graph here. On the x-axis are your different Forest Service regions that have whitebark pine. On the y-axis is percent of total climatically suitable area for whitebark pine. How much of that is in wilderness only, federally designated wilderness? Those are your blue bars. And how much is in wilderness and recommended wilderness or National Park Service lands in the yellow. And you can see the dark blue here. Those are the reference period, the light blue being the future period. Just with wilderness, federally designated wilderness alone already plays a huge role in the Pacific Southwest region, which is primarily California. Plays less of a role in the northern region, which is Montana, northern Idaho, and North Dakota. But across the board in all of these regions, that wilderness component, again, is becoming more and more important to climatically suitable habitat for whitebark pine. And so we introduced the results of the biological science as well as the social science in this larger workshop. We had a 2-day in-person workshop in Missoula at the end of January. And as part of, we included folks primarily from the Forest Service, as those were our primary collaborators for this case study, but we also included folks from National Park Service, several nonprofits, 2 tribal nations, and a few other partners as part of this workshop. And we had a total of about 35 people. And throughout the course of this workshop, in addition to introducing those science results, we followed this process to both evaluate the potential consequences of that transformation for whitebark pine, identify our collective or nationwide collective desired conditions and values for whitebark pine ecosystems in the United States, clarified how those values might be impacted by those transformations that we anticipate for whitebark pine ecosystems, generated different decision alternatives, and this is where the RAD framework first was introduced on how to address that transformation, and then evaluated the trade-offs, the social, ecological, legal trade-offs of choosing a resist, accept, or direct decision within the context of federally designated wilderness. And so this process is very similar if you're familiar with adaptive management, this iterative wheel, which is meant to allow you to evaluate these decisions in a very systematic way, but also learn from those decisions over time and be able to pivot if necessary. And so if we, let's say, choose a resist strategy today and implement that activity for X amount of time, we can evaluate the effectiveness of that strategy and come back around again. Did it actually achieve what we were hoping it would achieve? Did it help us reach our desired conditions or come close to reaching our desired conditions? If not, perhaps the ecological transformation is too strong and resist strategies are no longer effective. Maybe we choose something else. And so let's evaluate that again and try again. And so we introduced this process as part of the workshop and use this as a guide in our discussions and activities. And so I'm going to go into some of the discussion that we had as part of that workshop and some of the conversations and summaries from those conversations that we had. And so again, the first thing as part of that adaptive management process, we talked first about what folks valued about whitebark pine, and we had these conversations within those individual Forest Service regions in the United States. And also as part of that, we asked folks to think about what are your desired conditions for whitebark pine within your region specifically. And then we took those lists that we had from each of those Forest Service regions, and we created these nationwide lists of desired conditions collectively as a group. And this became actually a very long list, and so we had to divide it into a couple different categories here. The first being desired ecological conditions within wilderness for whitebark pine ecosystems, as well as social conditions for whitebark pine ecosystems. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but kind of some of the main points that came out of for the ecological conditions. A lot of folks felt that they wanted to maintain or promote resilient whitebark pine communities. They didn't want to see these communities be lost within wilderness, particularly after recognizing how important wilderness will be for whitebark pine restoration and conservation moving into the future. And so enhancing or maintaining functioning whitebark pine ecosystems, healthy and connected populations of whitebark pine, managing fire within wilderness to benefit whitebark pine, while also acknowledging vulnerability of certain individuals to fire, allocating greater protections for populations of high conservation value, and maintaining existing social and ecological interrelationships, which kind of leads into our desired social conditions that folks expressed for whitebark pine. And number one of those, of course, since we're considering wilderness here, even though we want to maintain whitebark pine and whitebark pine ecosystems on the landscape, but being conscious that we're doing that in a very mindful way to uphold those wilderness characteristics. So that was one collective desired social condition that we had. Also, just maintaining the aesthetic of whitebark pine on the landscape and maintaining opportunities for continued cultural relationships and practices such as cone and seed collecting, maintaining opportunities for research and monitoring, increasing capacity, facilities, and expertise or knowledge sufficient to meet restoration needs. This is kind of a capacity goal or a desired condition. Maintain feelings of wonderment and symbolic meanings associated with whitebark pine ecosystem experiences. And this could be relevant to people who recreate in the area, who spend a lot of time there for cultural practices. Recognize the contribution of whitebark pine to wilderness characteristics. A few people mentioned a shift in agency culture to focus on and dedicate resources specifically for the conservation of at-risk species. And so one of the interesting intersections for this case study in particular was this intersection of the Endangered Species Act with the Wilderness Act. And so whitebark pine being a federally threatened species, managers are mandated to conserve and recover this species. But when that legislation intersects or that policy intersects with the Wilderness Act, where activities may be highly scrutinized, that kind of creates an interesting little rift to explore. And so perhaps talking more deeply and considering more deeply kind of that focus to dedicate resources to the conservation of these at-risk species, even though they tend to occur, and a lot of them do tend to occur within wilderness. And then finally, better tell our story. And so just increasing education, public awareness, outreach for whitebark pine and whitebark pine ecosystems. And so after we introduced and kind of came up with this comprehensive list of what do we want wilderness to be for whitebark pine, what is the role of wilderness for whitebark pine restoration and conservation, we introduced the RAD framework, and again, resist, accept, direct, all different opportunities to respond to ecological transformation. And we had folks come up with a list of what they thought, again, within their own individual regions, what they thought they could do to contribute to this larger nationwide list of desired conditions for whitebark pine and whitebark pine ecosystems. And this is just a small sample of the actions that folks came up with, potential actions within wilderness. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but we had them kind of free think about different activities that could take place in wilderness to help us reach those desired conditions. And then we had folks sort them into the different resist, accept, and direct categories or camps. And one of the things that we noticed when we did this activity with folks is that there were very few direct strategies that emerged as part of these conversations, as well as within the groups in general. There were a lot of resist actions that came up. Folks really don't want to lose whitebark pine on the landscape, particularly within wilderness areas. And so kind of falling back to those sort of tried and true methods, such as planting rust-resistant seedlings, thinning forests, et cetera, actions that we've used in the past, as well as a number of accept options. And so these options, again, not directly addressing the transformation of whitebark pine ecosystems, but perhaps engaging in more education and outreach to increase awareness of disappearing whitebark pine ecosystems, bolstering partnerships that we have with tribes and other management agencies, and perhaps we're not influencing the trajectory of transformation today, but this information that we gather today could be leveraged at some point in the future to assist with restoration and conservation activities. And so we dove more specifically into a handful of these strategies that people wanted to explore. And so this was moving into evaluating the trade-offs if we're assessing the social ecological trade-offs of these competing strategies. And so we had 2 resist strategies. I won't read through these. We got very specific in what these strategies might entail on the ground. But the first strategy was direct planting of rust-resistant seedlings in wilderness. The second resist strategy was direct seeding. So not planting seedlings, but seeding in wilderness. The accept strategy was cone collection within wilderness, and the direct strategy was assisted range expansion And what this means is moving populations just outside of the existing range of whitebark pine, and that included moving and planting seedlings outside of the existing range of whitebark pine into areas that are currently unoccupied by whitebark pine. And so how do we evaluate these trade-offs? And how do we begin to select an alternative strategy? And knowing that the science that went into this, we used our best available data to determine where, perhaps when we're thinking about assisted migration in particular, where habitat may be more climatically suitable in the future. However, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the models that go into producing these output. And not only uncertainty involved in that future forecasting, but uncertainty associated with, well, what happens on the ground if we actually do this? How is the ecology of that specific area going to be affected? How are cultural relationships going to be affected, et cetera? And so how do we break down all those competing trade-offs? To do that, we introduced another tool. It's called the Futures Wheel. And what the Futures Wheel helps us do is to really expand on and fully consider all the potential cascading implications of choosing a specific decision alternative. And so we use this as a tool to evaluate what are all the consequences, positive or negative, of choosing one of these alternative strategies. And so we took those 4 RAD strategies that I mentioned on those previous slides, and we created 4 of these futures wheels in small groups during the course of the workshop. And so with that, we put the RAD alternative or the RAD decision at the center of each wheel. And then those orange circles that you're seeing most immediately coming off of that wheel are the first order implications of choosing that decision alternative or implementing that decision alternative. The yellow circles being the second order, and then the third order consequences of implementing that alternative. And I'll get to what that looks like in a second. And then what we also had people do as a thought exercise was score each of those consequences coming off of each of those decisions by both the likelihood that they thought that implication would occur as a result of that decision and the desirability of that implication occurring. And so if something is highly desirable, it would be a breakthrough, it would be a triumph. If something was highly undesirable, it would be a catastrophe. And then similarly for likelihood, we had a sliding scale from extremely unlikely. We weren't confident that that implication would occur, but we still wanted to account for it, to implications that we were extremely confident would occur as a result of that decision. And so we had all these sticky notes. It was very colorful where we had folks put the decision alternative at the center. We had our 2 resist groups, our accept group and a direct group, and they expanded out trying to consider all the implications of making that decision. So what you're seeing here on the right is just kind of a breakdown, sort of dichotomous key almost, from our first order consequences in the red, second order in the orange, and the third order for this particular group in the gray. And this was for our planting rust-resistant seedlings. And so this was our first resist strategy. And some of the big takeaways that came out of this strategy was that some participants in regions where there was still quite a bit of whitebark pine outside wilderness just felt like this was not feasible for them. They felt that they wouldn't be able to get approval to implement this within wilderness in general, that would get turned down. But for other regions where there was a need to act within wilderness, they felt that this might be a feasible option. There was also a lot of confidence in successful establishment, planting rust-resistant seedlings. This is something that has been used before, so sort of a tried and true method. But there would be short impacts to wilderness character implementing this particular strategy. For the second option of direct seeding, so not planting seedlings, but direct seeding, there was a little more hesitancy with this particular strategy, primarily because of the anticipated low likelihood of success as compared to planting. And so this is something that hasn't been tested as much as direct planting, and some of the testing has revealed that establishment is actually less successful. And so even though direct seeding would initially in the short term have less trammeling on the landscape as compared to planting, it might actually entail more trammeling over time if not initially successful, because that would require multiple trips into the wilderness, multiple events where they would have to reseed, etc. And so out across the long term, this action may not be as favorable. For cone collection under our accept strategy, folks, again, this is kind of a tried and true method, felt there was high confidence in the successful implementation of this particular strategy. And so most folks felt that this would be feasible. There will be several shorter term impacts to wilderness, but overall perceived low impact to wilderness character. However, cone collection can be particularly costly and detract from implementation of other projects outside of whitebark pine. For our direct strategy, this was assisted range expansion of whitebark pine, so planting seedlings into new areas in wilderness where they currently don't occur, but in areas that are expected to be more climatically suitable in the future. There was a lot of hesitancy, particularly from folks that work primarily in wilderness around this decision. And they were more likely to consider implementing this decision outside of wilderness due to this high uncertainty of success associated with this activity and potential downstream impacts that haven't been well quantified yet. Others felt that there might not be time to experiment outside of wilderness, that we're kind of working against the clock already, and that setting up some of these plots within wilderness would be necessary, particularly in regions such as California, where there really aren't options outside of wilderness currently. This could potentially also have the most impact to wilderness character. Again, we're completely changing, actively changing the composition of that landscape by introducing a new species that hasn't been there previously. And so there was hesitancy around that. And so it might be necessary to consider the introduction. And this was kind of an interesting thing that came up in some of their conversations, where perhaps moving whitebark pine into new areas to save the species in and of itself might be necessary, but what happens to those areas where whitebark pine is leaving? And this is kind of outside of the strategy, but there was quite a bit of conversation around, well, it might be necessary to introduce new tree species or regionally local tree species into those areas where whitebark pine is receding to conserve those ecosystem services that whitebark pine previously provided. And so just some key takeaways that we had throughout the course of this case study. I know that was a lot that I tried to condense down, but in general, we recognize and our models have demonstrated that climatically suitable area for whitebark pine is shifting. It's moving out or contracting, particularly in areas of low elevation, areas that are expected or projected to get hotter into the future, and wilderness as an effect of that, because a lot of the times wilderness are in within these high elevation areas are sort of these refugia. So you can say for whitebark pine, or becoming more important as habitat for whitebark pine moving into the future. Currently, most of the restoration activities managers are taking are outside of wilderness, unless there are no options to do this outside of wilderness. Again, thinking of Region 5, where California is. And managers generally feel constrained when considering actions within wilderness, although they recognize that these actions may be necessary to take within wilderness, particularly down the line and into the future. Managers in general just want to see healthy populations of whitebark pine in wilderness. However, managers do admit that they might be shifting towards conserving ecosystem services rather than whitebark pine specifically. Again, kind of harkening back to that last comment from the direct group. Resist and accept options were common. People generated these pretty openly and pretty freely, but direct options weren't as common when folks were trying to think of different RAD alternative strategies. Again, these direct options are inherently risky. However, they might be necessary in wilderness if we're losing whitebark pine outside of wilderness. And all of these activities, resist, accept, or direct, at least that we considered in this workshop, do have some impact on wilderness character. Oftentimes it was short-term impact to wilderness character, but sometimes there could be lasting effects or repeated acts of trammeling over time, particularly when we're thinking about direct seeding as compared to direct planting, depending on the success of that particular strategy. And so where we're moving next, I kind of alluded to this early on in the presentation before my computer decided to take a nap, was that we are working on producing a full report of this case study. So including those results from the workshop, our science analyses, both the biological and social science analyses, in a full report for this whitebark pine case study. And then we're actually going to be taking this case study along with our 3 other case studies and combining them into a general technical report. And then as part of this case study specifically, we're also intending to produce peer-reviewed manuscripts, including output from that biological science analysis of climatic suitability, which has already been submitted, as well as some cross-case study interview results and syntheses from this particular case study, kind of comparing how managers are responding to or perceiving constraints of acting within wilderness, and have whitebark pine be a part of that conversation within that manuscript. All right, and so that is my entire presentation. There's my email. If you have any questions or just want to chat about this at any time, feel free to reach out. Jacqueline Fox Rushing is a counterpart of mine on this project. She did the social science analyses and ran the interviews. And if you're interested in learning more about that in particular, that is her email. So thank you. And I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much for your talk, Kira. And I was so impressed by how you just kept on giving an incredible presentation, even when your computer decided to take a nap. I would like to open up the opportunity for our attendants to share comments or questions they might have. We have about 9 minutes left, so please type your questions or comments into the chat. And if we don't have enough time to go over your questions, do not worry. Our team will send them over to Kira with your contact information for further discussion if you all decide that you want to do that. Since we have a little less than 10 minutes, I am going to hop into the first question. So this question is from Laurel. Kira, would you be able to tell us a bit more about the survey methods for evaluating the nationwide desired conditions?
Yeah, so for those desired conditions, those were all generated through the course of that 2-day workshop. And so really all we did for that is we broke people up into smaller groups by their regional association. So not everybody worked for the Forest Service, but if they worked or were primarily concerned with a particular region, we kind of grouped those folks together. And we had them come up with their region specific list. What do they want wilderness to look like for whitebark pine ecosystems? What role did they want wilderness to play for whitebark pine ecosystems? And so we kind of just started there. It was sort of it wasn't very structured. It was more of a free brainstorm. And then we took those collective lists and put them together. We kind of came back as a larger group, and we had people contribute, kind of share out their small group ideas. And then we had just a conversation among the larger group about where the commonalities were, kind of nationally, where are our goals across regions. And we kind of summarized our individual groups and then brought those into the larger group discussion to create that nationwide list.
Great. Thank you for elaborating on that. Our next question is from Robin. Would you be able to explain how the resist actions are different from the direct actions? Both seem to involve a bit of the active restoration side.
Yeah, definitely. So resist versus direct, kind of the big differences between those strategies. The big difference between those 2 strategies is what your future conditions are going to look like. So under your resist strategy, your primary focus under the resist strategy is try to keep things the same as they are now or how they have been historically for as long as possible. So if we're working in a forest that's primarily a whitebark pine dominated overstory at the top of this mountain, we want to try to keep that looking like that for as long as possible. Versus a direct strategy, perhaps we recognize that resist may no longer be effective at some point in the future, is too costly, involves too much active management over time. Instead of trying to keep that whitebark pine ecosystem there on that top of that hypothetical mountain for as long as possible, perhaps we're moving that population somewhere else, or we're replacing those whitebark pine trees with a different tree species that maybe aren't whitebark pine, but can still conserve some of those ecosystem services that whitebark pine provides. And so that future, that forest on the top of that mountain is going to look pretty different than it does today. So we're directing that trajectory, but we are doing it in a mindful way where we are trying to perhaps retain some of those ecosystem services. And so we're directing that transformation towards something that is desirable instead of just letting it go. Hopefully that helps.
Great, thank you. We still have time for a couple more questions. So our next question is from Richard. They are wondering what the data source for the future climatically suitable what was the data source for the future climatically suitable whitebark pine habitat presented here? And are there any spatial layers available?
Yes, so we use TerraClimate, if you're familiar with TerraClimate, to get those projected future climate layers. And yes, we do have a number of spatial data layers. If you're interested in using those for other projects, I can talk to Sean Parks, who did the modeling for that, get you guys connected and see if we can do some data sharing.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Laura Jones. Prior to the report and other products being available, do you have a suggested citation for the workshop or this presentation?
Not in addition to what we're already producing. We are working, our first deliverable that's going to be coming out is that final report, which is going to include all of these discussions and summaries from the workshop. And so when we release that, we're hoping to have that done within the next 5 months. Once that's completed, I'd be happy to share the citation for that report. That will be put through our policy review process. It's not going to be officially published like we might do through the research station, but it will be made publicly available. And so we'll repositories as well that you can share and link to.
Great, thank you. And then a question from Aaron Clark. Are your findings being used in the ESA whitebark pine programmatic consultation process?
Not that I'm aware currently. I'd love to have that conversation. I think for me, like my biggest passion is being able to integrate the work that we are doing into those programmatic planning processes that you all are implementing or involved in. And so if there's any way that we can be useful or tie into existing planning processes, I'm happy to talk. Feel free to reach out to me, and yeah, let's keep the conversation going.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead with one more question, and then we will go ahead and wrap up. Laurel was also curious about who attends the workshops, like managers, some researchers, etc.
Yeah, so it's been a little bit different depending on which case study. For this one, we had a good mix of folks from nonprofits. We had Forest Service managers, we had National Park Service managers, and some tribal nations as well represented at this workshop. It was a good mix of folks. For our Isle Royal workshop, that was a much more intimate case study that we did. That was primarily with tribal members, as well as National Park Service staff. For the BLM case study, that was primarily managers. We did have a few folks from NGOs, nonprofits. And then for the Fish and Wildlife Service Sonoran Pronghorn case study, we had primarily folks that were managers, but both state agency and federal agency, as well as one nonprofit individual is represented at that workshop. But it just varied from case to case. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much. We are nearing the end of your time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. On behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and the webinar organization team, I want to thank Kira again for your participation. Our next webinar will be held on April 15th with Sharon Hood, who will be presenting her work on constitutive and induced defenses in bristlecone and foxtail pines, exploring trade-offs between resin ducts, chemistry, and growth. And thank you again, everyone, for attending, and stay tuned for upcoming installments, and see you all next month.